On va demander à Emmanuel s'il nous entend bien. Hi, Emmanuel. Can you hear us?
Hello? Yeah, I can hear you.
Nice. Vous avez coupé le son de la salle pour le test. So you hear me well? If I stand here and talk, that is very good. Emmanuel, can you still hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you. It's not great, the quality of the sounds.
Tu viens la fenêtre qui est en bas, ça va te cacher tes slides.
Non, mais
prendre un micro aussi. Ah, en fait, je suis d'abord. Voilà. Et on tient un peu mieux.
Sorry, I can barely hear you.
Ah, it's not better with the microphone.
I think there's a lot of interference from something.
You think that there is some background noise or just the sound of the voice is not enough?
Yeah, it's mostly the background that I hear, not the actual voice.
Okay. Well, we'll try to make the microphone closer to Ilyass.
Ça marchait dans les tests, évidemment. Voilà. Enfin, le micro de la salle, du coup, ça. C'est compliqué. Yeah. Can you hear us? Emmanuel, can you hear us now? Okay.
Ça marche toujours pas? Can you give us a feedback, Emmanuel, if you hear us?
Yep, I can now hear you very well.
Okay, perfect. Non, super. Okay, so
Yeah, if you have some problems, Emmanuel,
just tell us in the chat and we'll fix it when we can.
je te télécommande, elle est où?
So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the defense of Ilyass Moummad. My name is Pineda. I'm a Invariant, and I have the honor to be chairing this session today. I will start by introducing the committee. So, first, the reviewers. So, we have Alexis Joly, who is the directeur de recherche at Invariant and at the Laboratoire d'informatique, de robotique et de microélectronique de Montpellier. We have Richard Marxer, which is a professor at l'Université de Toulon, et the Laboratoire d'informatique du système. With the examiners, we have Anna-Maria Messersch, sorry, who is assistant professor at Tampere University. And then we have a guest who is online, Mr. Emmanuel Benetus, who is a reader at the Queen Mary University of London. And then Nicolas Farougian, Professor INT Atlantique, who is the director, and Romain Sarizel, who is the conférence at the University of Lorraine, who is the thesis co-supervisor of co-encadre in French. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. And Ilyass, as you know, you have 45 minutes to present your PhD, and then we will have a series of questions.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the introduction, and welcome everyone. Welcome jury members who's attending both in person and virtually. My name is Ilyass Moummad, and I'll be talking about my PhD topic entitled Invariant Representation Learning for Few-Shot Bioacoustic Event Detection and Classification. So imagine yourself, you're walking through the forest and you see this view of nice trees and you hear this sound. You hear birds chirping and it gives you pleasant feeling about the health. Now imagine you're in a different scenario like this and you hear this sound. You hear human activity and noise, and this gives you a bad idea about the health of the ecosystem. In the recent centuries, the human population has been growing exponentially, and at the same time, we've been converting more land area to our daily use. And this causes a loss of the species in our ecosystem. So this map shows the distribution and the richness of the species around the globe, split into 3 different groups: the birds, the mammals, and the amphibians. And the bright regions show where there is a lot of species in areas like South America. The second figure shows the distribution of the threatened species. And we can see that the bright spots represent the biodiversity hotspot, where we have more threatened species, And this is especially the case in tropical regions, where they are more sensitive to environment changes, like climate change and deforestation. Bioacoustics is one of the ways to monitor the wildlife. It is a non-invasive approach, and there are two types of acoustic monitoring. The first type is active monitoring, where we are actively looking for the species to monitor. We record the sources of the vocalizations, and it sounds like this. As we can hear, the sound is clear because we are directing the recorder toward the species of interest. We have another type of monitoring called passive monitoring or soundscape, and it sounds like this. As we can hear, we have more sources in the passive monitoring because we are not actively looking for species. So we could have background noise or other species vocalizing at the same time. There are multiple platforms for open science like Xenocanto that permits wildlife enthusiasts and biologists to upload their data in this platform so that researchers can use this data to advance the research for sound species recognition and classification. Now that we have data that is collected, how can we represent the sound? It can either be represented by the waveform, which represents the changes in the amplitude of the sound wave over time. There are other types of representations, for instance, the MES spectrogram that is frequently used in bioacoustics that represents the changes in the amplitude of frequencies over time. Now, suppose we're interested in a species of interest, we collected some few data. What we would desire is to train a neural network to capture some informative features about this data, so that when we are given a new species data, we can predict some informative features by using this neural network. However, having only few data is not enough to train efficiently neural networks. What we could do instead, one solution, is to collect some other related data of our problem, train a neural network on this data to capture informative features, and then transfer the knowledge from this problem to our new problem with only a few data. This third part is called representation learning. It's going to be the focus of my talk. And the second part is called few-shot learning, where we evaluate the generalization capabilities of model trained using representation learning. So the question that arises is, how can we learn efficiently representations that can be transferred to new problems with only few data? One of the main challenges of transfer learning is the domain shift, where we could have data that is used for representation learning from different domains that the one for our new problem. For instance, we could have used different recorders, or our data is from different environments that the one that are for the few-shot learning problem. We could also have different species that were not seen during the first phase of representation learning. There are different approaches to solve the few-shot learning problem. The first family is the black box. In this family of methods, we give the model the data from our problem that is labeled, and we give it a new sample unlabeled to predict which label this sample corresponds to. And the model by itself will find the learning strategy to solve the problem. It is expressive. However, it is difficult to optimize because we do not have an inductive bias for the learning strategy. The second family is optimization-based, and in this family of methods, we want to learn a good network initialization, that from this initialization, we can solve new problems with only few iterations. It is model agnostic. However, it does demand high compute because it tries to solve two optimization problems at the same time. The last family is non-parametric, and this family of methods look at the neural network space as a metric space and try to approach the problem by computing distances in the latent space to make the predictions. This last family of approach is easy to optimize. However, it is limited to discriminative tasks. We're going to focus on this last family because we're interested in classification and detection of sound events. There are many different applications possible in bioacoustics. One application, it could be that we recorded some data and we are interested in an event. We could annotate few instances of this event in our recording, and we wish to learn a few short learning system that tries to find the other instances of the event of interest. Another application, it could be that we are not interested exactly in the exact temporal annotation, but more like we want to classify the clip level. So for instance, we could have a new example and we want to compare it to other audio recordings and find which class does this clip correspond to. This is going to be the outline of my talk. First, I'm going to give a brief overview of state-of-the-art methods for representation learning and few-shot learning that we use in our works. Then I'm going to talk about three contributions. One with the focus of supervised representation learning. The second with the focus of self-supervised learning when we don't have access to label data. And finally, a focus on a large-scale data set where we have access to weak labels, which means we have labels on the whole audio recording, but not the exact temporal annotation. And finally, we're going to conclude with the findings and limitations of these contributions and open some research questions for perspective. Let's first start with the state-of-the-art methods for representation learning. I'm going to mainly focus on these methods in representation learning. So first, the supervised learning when we have access to labeled data, the self-supervised learning when we have access to unlabeled data, which have two common families, the self-prediction methods that we're going to define, and also the invariant learning, which is going to be the focus of our works. Two types of invariant learning, the contrastive methods and the feature decorrelation methods. And to evaluate these learned representations, we're going to use few-shot learning to evaluate them. And we're going to focus on the non-parametric methods, which consider the metric learning. Let's start with the representation learning. So the goal of representation learning is to extract some meaningful representations of our data. If we have access to labeled data, we can apply supervised learning. One simple way of doing supervised learning is to map the data points to indices of the class categories that they correspond to. And that way, the latent or intermediate layer of the neural network will learn to extract meaningful representations implicitly. Another straightforward way is to directly optimize for the latent space of the deep learning model by clustering data points in the latent space by the corresponding classes. For instance, the supervised contrastive laws optimize for this behavior. So the supervised contrastive laws, also known as label invariant learning, which tries to learn representations that is invariant to the label, which means that examples for the same classes will have similar representations in the latent space. This is the loss point function for the supervised contrastive. It tries to optimize in the numerator the similarity between the anchor and the positive. So each example in the data set will correspond to an anchor, and we will maximize its similarity with the positives, which means the examples from the same class. And in the denominator, we will have the similarities of the anchor with all other examples that are from different classes and are called negatives. So we will try to minimize this similarity at the same time. So supervised learning can be efficient for learning meaningful representations. However, it does require manual annotation, which can demand domain expertise, can be time-consuming, and also can be expensive. The question that arises is, how can we learn meaningful representations from the data without using any label? One way to do that is the self-supervised learning. And we have two families of self-supervised learning. The first family is the self-prediction methods, where we try to predict some missing part of the data given the other part. So for instance, here we solve an inventing problem, and we try to recover the missing patches from the input data. The other family of methods is invariant learning. And in this family of methods, we will try to generate views from the same data that will still try to represent the same semantic, and we will try to match their latent representations to be similar. For the first family of self-prediction methods, they've been shown that they provide good initialization for fine-tuning on new problems. They also provide a good encoder for low-level tasks, such as segmentation. However, they require specific type of architectures like transformer, and they also require longer training epochs in order to converge. And also, they are limited to the self-supervised learning. For the invariant learning, they provide a good encoder that solves few shots problem with few examples. They support supervised learning, as we've seen with the supervised contrastive loss. However, they do require the domain expertise to generate the views, and they underperform in the low-level tasks. We're going to focus on this second family called invariant learning because we are interested in solving few-shot problems with very few data. So the invariance is with respect to different views that is created to data transformations. For instance, for illustration, we show here a simple flip on the images. And so we want to group examples with their corresponding augmented versions in the latent space. So suppose we have a data point, we can generate two views using data transformation, and we wish to match their latent representations. If we naively optimize for this objective in the training loss, there is a simple solution that the model can find, which is to output a constant vector to any images in the data sets, whether they are related or not. So we do require some regularization to prevent this collapsing behavior. One solution to do that is the contrastive learning, where we try to output similar representations to different views of the data. Here we have the anchor that is put together with the positive in the embedding space. And at the same time, it is pulled apart from other examples of the data. And these examples are called the negatives. So during training, each example will play the role of the anchor. That's why we have a loss, we have the sum over I in the loss function. Another family of self-supervised learning that try to prevent the collapse behavior are feature decorrelation. And in this type of family, we try to maximize the utilization of the whole embedding space. So we want to maximize the coverage of this latent space. And by doing that, we hope to learn some meaningful features. There are multiple ways to optimize for this feature decorrelation behavior. We're going to focus on one known method called Barlow twins. And let's break it down. We start by a batch of samples called X. We sample two views by using data transformation. So we generate YA and YB. We encode these two generated batches to obtain the matrices ZA and ZB. We compute the cross-correlation matrix between ZA and ZB. And we try to push this matrix to be close to the identity matrix. So what will this do is that for each embedding matrices, it will match the similar features from the two A and B. And at the same time, it will decorrelate different features for each matrix. So that will decorrelate the encoding of our data. And that way, we can learn meaningful representations. Now, to evaluate these methods for representation learning, we use few-shot learning and the simple method for non-parametric approach that's considered a metric space. We're going to focus on this specific type of learning called prototypical learning. So when we have a new problem with few data, we can use the pre-trained neural network to project this data in the latent space. And we can compute, for instance, prototypes for each class to represent each of the classes of our problem. In this example, we have 3 classes. So when we are given a new sample, we can project it in this same space, compute distances to make the prediction for this new example. Could be sound or images. It can work with any modality. So now that we've given a brief overview of the state-of-the-art methods for representation learning and few-shot learning, we're going to start with our first contribution, which focuses on the supervised case when we have precise annotations of our event, which means we have the onset and the offset of each sound event, with the specific application of the bioacoustic event detection. So suppose we have some data, some labeled data, with audio recordings that are labeled corresponding to each instance of the event. We try to learn some representation on this supervised data, so we can transfer it to new problems or new audio recordings and use few-shot learning to solve the problem of detecting the events using only few labeled instances. So to focus first on the representation learning, we use the supervised contrastive learning that we just seen earlier. We learn an embedding space where examples are clustered with corresponding to the label. So we would desire an embedding space where we have the examples that are scattered around all the space. However, in the contrastive learning, it's been shown that this task can be solved in the subspace, which means it can be solved in less dimensions, so the model will not exploit all the dimensions of the embedding space. So inspired by the feature decorrelation in self-supervision, we do optimize this embedding space to cover all its dimensions. And one way to do that, we use regularization term that has been shown to work well in the self-supervision literature. And it does measure how much quantity is in the latent space. So it does have a covariance term, which is Z times Z transpose. And this will encode how much information we do have in the embedding space. So when we maximize this quantity, we'll maximize the capacity of the latent space. Now that we learned some meaningful representations, we can transfer them to our new few-shot learning problem. Now we have audio recordings with few labeled instances, and we want to try to predict the other occurrences for the rest of the audio recording. We can sample in between these instances and define our few-shot detection problem as a binary classification problem where we have two classes, some examples for the present samples and some other for the absent samples. So now that we have our audio recording with two instances, absent and present, we can use our pre-trained neural network to project these samples in the embedding space. If it is well structured like this, we can compute prototypes for the presence and absence. And given a new query window, we can project it in the embedding space. We can compute the distances to the corresponding prototypes and predict the label of the closest prototype. So for this example, for instance, the closest prototype is the positive prototype. So we can say at this window, we have the event of interest. Now, suppose our space is not well structured. So we want to optimize or fine-tune this feature extractor to be adapted to our new few-shot problem. What we could do is to push the examples towards their corresponding prototypes. And that way, we hope to have a better separable embedding space. Evaluate our approach on the GCase 2023 benchmark, which is part of an annual challenge for bioacoustic event detection. It provides different datasets for training and different datasets for validation or testing. So we can see from this table that we have different mic types. So we can have the mics that are used for testing are different from the mics that are used for recording the training data. So we already have a challenge of the domain shift. And the goal of this task is to learn to detect animal vocalizations from only 5 examples. The challenge gives 2 baselines, one that is based on simple matching that is called template matching, that does not require any learning, and a second method, protonets, that requires training neural network using meta-learning. First, we apply methods that do not require any fine-tuning for the adaptation stage. We only focus on the learning of representation during the first stage. So we first apply the supervised contrastive loss. We train a linear classifier on top of this frozen embedding. And we obtain around 62 in F1 score, which is nice results compared to the baselines. Second, we apply a prototype classifier that do not require any training, which is non-parametric. And we can see that we obtain less result than the linear classifier. However, we have higher recall. So we focus on this second approach. We apply the regularization to the embedding space during pre-training, which is the upper part. And we can see that it improves the F1 score by almost 2%. Second, we focus on methods that do require fine-tuning. We compare with state-of-the-art methods, and we apply the same approaches as fine-tuning free methods, but we do fine-tune the model during the adaptation. And we can see that using the linear classifier does not improve even if we try to do fine-tuning. However, by using the prototype classifier and pushing the examples towards their prototypes, we can improve the embedding space and find better detection for this problem. Finally, we have methods that do use extra data during adaptation. Either they will try to use data from other sources like audio set, or we will reuse the pre-training data during the adaptation. They obtain good results, but they require extra compute for each new few-shot problem. And we've shown that with simple solution, like using prototypes, we obtain already competitive results while being efficient. So for this first study, we've shown that supervised interactive learning can capture meaningful and discriminative features that can transfer across species. We also showed that regularizing the feature space can improve the learning of the features. And we showed that prototype learning can further adapt these features to new problems. And some part of this work, we used it to submit to the challenge 2023, and we ranked second. And we won the jury award for this task. We also published two works as a result of this study at the DK's 2023 and ICAS 2024. Some of the limitations of this study is that adapting the features to new problems do require fine-tuning, which requires additional compute. And for real-life scenarios, if you want to do real-time, this approach requires more compute. And also in this study, we do require precise temporal annotation to train using supervision in the pre-training stage. And when we move to larger scale, it is costly to annotate more data on a larger scale. For our second contribution, we're going to focus on the self-supervised learning, where we try to learn representations from audio without having the annotation of where the event of interest happened. And we're going to focus on a specific application of the bird species sound classification. So for self-supervision, especially with invariant learning, we saw that we require to create views from the data. So the question that arises is which data transformation should we apply for bioacoustic sounds? So first we select some window and we apply the mass spectrogram transformation to our model, and then we need to sample two views from this data. We look at the vision domain. The common augmentation that is used to generate views is the resized crop. And as we can see from this image, is that it keeps the same information from the first image in the generated view. And a recent study that will be presented next week at NeurIPS shows that only this resized crop is efficient to learn meaningful representations. In the audio domain, some works try to use the same augmentation of resized crop on the mass spectrogram, especially the study Bio for Audio. And what they do is that they crop a specific rectangle in the mass spectrogram and try to resize it to its original size. It's been shown to work well for classical audio problems, like separate daily sounds, like a car sound versus a bird sound. However, for domain-specific application, we will see that this technique may not work. So let's first hear a bird sound. Now we can apply the resized crop for this sound. And as you can hear from this resized crop, that we stretched the temporal and also the spectral information of the sound. And this may also distort the learned features from the model when we use this data augmentation. And for specific domain-specific applications, when we need to discriminate between species, this data augmentation may not work. So instead, we either need to come up with data augmentation that can work for bird sounds, or we can use some data augmentations that are domain agnostic. So first, we propose to use time shift that will either shift forwards or backwards of the signal. Then we apply some masking of consecutive bands of frequencies and time steps to remove some random information from the sound. And finally, we apply some spectrogram mixing, which will mix the sound with random sounds from the data set that will simulate some background noise. And we will hear one example of what is the resulting sound like. As we can hear from this generated sound, that we still kept the information of the original sound, but we added some random background species singing at the same time. So this can generate different views that still represent the same information that we want to keep in our recording. And finally, we use invariant learning with any of the self-supervised learning losses that we've seen. We experiment with the meta audio benchmark, especially the BirdClef 2020 dataset that contain more than 700 bird species. And it is split into 3 different splits with different species for each split. And the goal of this benchmark is to learn to classify birds from only one example, and they consider the problems of 5 class classification problems. So we train on species from the training, and we want to transfer the learning to new species. So we have an audio recording, and we need to select the window that we will use for training. We don't have any annotation of the temporal of when the event did start or end. So the simple strategy is to sample randomly in the audio recording. This is the first strategy we'll use. And for the audio recordings for testing, we chunk the audio recording into multiple chunks. We use the trained feature extractor on the training set to represent these chunks. And we will average all the embedding vectors into one prototype for the audio. So for each audio for testing, we will have one embedding vector that represents it. Now we do project it in the embedding space, and we compare it. We compare the distances. We compute the distances with the other prototypes, which mean the 5 classes of our 5-class future learning problem. And we make the prediction of the label with the closest prototype. For the results of this first strategy of randomly selection window during training, we look at the results of the model. So first we have the supervised baselines given by the benchmark. And in the last line, we have the supervised contrasted method, which is supervised reference to have an idea of what the model should perform. And we see that already with the supervised baseline, we outperform the previous methods with our simple data augmentation techniques. We look at pre-trained models from the literature, some that are trained on images, SimSiam, which is trained on natural images, the dataset ImageNet, DCore, which is a model that is trained on speech using self-supervision, and CNN14, which is a model known for being trained on audio sets, a dataset of more than 500 classes using supervised learning. And we see that this model do not perform well for this specific domain of bird sounds, which suggests that we need knowledge specific for this domain. Finally, we look at the self-supervised learning methods that we seen earlier, so the contrastive method SimClear and the feature decorrelation method Barlow-Twins. We see that these 2 methods outperform the pre-trained backbones. However, they fall behind the supervised baselines. So we assume that the training window strategy with the random selection is not optimal for learning meaningful features. What we can do instead of the random selection to maybe use some signal processing methods that can detect which part of the audio has high energy, or we can use a pre-trained neural network that can detect bird activity. I'll fit for this last solution. And we use a model that has been trained on audio set, which consists of 2 million 10-second clips from YouTube. And this model can output activations for more than 500 classes. And one of the classes is the bird class. And even though this class only has 1% of the training data, we still use this model to select our training window. So suppose we have audio recording, we will slide a window and compute bird activations at each sliding window and choose the window with the highest activation. And that will be our training sample. As for the results, first we will apply this model that we use for selecting the window on this bird benchmark. And we can see that it performs in terms of accuracy around 33%. And by using this model that is not good at this task for selecting the window, we can see that it improves the performance for all the models, either the supervised ones or the self-supervised ones, when we use this selection only for training windows, or when we use it also for the testing windows. And we can see, especially for the self-supervised method SimClear, we have more than 20% gain in terms of accuracy. This shows that this selection technique is efficient. Now we apply an ablation study for the three proposed data augmentation techniques. First, we have the baselines. The last column Ri represents a random initialized network that has not been trained. If we focus on the supervised contrastive method, for each line, we will remove one data augmentation and keep the other two. And we can see that for the supervised learning method, even if we remove one of the data augmentation, we do not lose that much in performance. This shows that label invariance is enough to learn meaningful representations. As for the self-supervised models, we can see that we can have a big drop in performance, especially if we remove the spectrogram mixing data augmentation, which will add a random noise or random sample to the training data. And the performance is close to a random initialized network. This shows that the spectrogram mixing is important for learning discriminative features. In this study, we showed that we can learn informative features of bird sounds without any label information. And we showed that using a pre-trained neural network for selecting training window is an effective strategy. We published this work at the Self-Supervised for Audio, Speech, and Beyond workshop at ICAST 2024. One of the limitations of this study is we already know in advance that we have a bird sound in the audio recording. So we will select a window even though if the activation is as low as 10%. One of the limitations is that this benchmark that we used, the meta audio, only focused on 5 class setups. And this does not reflect real-world applications. Now we move to the third contribution, where we focus on the weakly supervised. So we have labels, but only for the clip level, but we don't know exactly when the event happened. We will focus on the same task of bird species sound classification, but with an additional challenge, which is the domain shift. So we will have audio recordings that are recorded using active monitoring, and we train a model on them and test this model on new recordings that are recorded using passive recording. Let's take a step back and look at the supervised contrastive loss. So in the numerator, we have the similarities between the anchor and the positive. And in the denominator, we have the similarity between the anchor and the negatives. So if we use bigger batches of data, we are more likely to have more positives in the numerator. And at the same time, we will have more negatives in the denominator. So having a larger batch will improve the learning. However, it will require more compute because for each example, we will compare the similarities between all the examples in the batch. To gain more insights about the supervised contrastive loss, we can look at its gradient with respect to the anchor. So this is the gradient of the supervised contrastive loss. It has 2 terms. One term, the first term that will pull the anchor to the prototype of the class, and one second term that will push it apart from a weighted average of all the examples in the batch. So drawing inspiration from this first term that will pull the example to the prototype, we suggest to use prototypes instead of computing similarities with respect to all samples. So we propose to use prototypes. We call it prototypical contrastive learning, or ProtoClear for short. And in the loss function, we can see that now in the numerator, we will compare the anchor only to the prototype of each class, which means we will only have one positive similarity. And in the denominator, we will only compare the anchor to the negative prototypes instead of computing the similarities between all the examples in the batch. Similarly, we compute the gradients, and we can see that the first term is similar to the supervised contrastive positive term that will pull the example to its corresponding prototype. And the second term is different. So instead of pushing it apart from a weighted average of all the examples, and this time it will push it apart from a weighted average of the prototypes of other classes. As term of application, so we will apply representation learning on active recording, and we will test them in future learning on passive monitoring recordings. So we use this data set we have in the training vocal recordings from Xenocanto, and in the test we will use soundscape recordings from public datasets. The same data sets are used in the benchmark for retrieval called BERT. So we use some state-of-the-art models to compare our methods. We use first BERT AVs, which is a self-supervision method that will try to mask some units in the embedding space and try to cluster them in the output of this model. This is a self-prediction method. Another state-of-the-art method that we compare with is the audio language contrastive model that will try to align audio representation of bird sounds with corresponding text captions. And these text captions are created using class names as well as metadata. Finally, we use the third baseline to compare our models, which is a model trained on the same dataset Xenocanto that has 3 classifiers. So one will classify the species, and other classifiers will classify either order of the taxonomy, like genus and order. So we experiment first with one-shot classification. These are the accuracy of a random guess. First, we look at the self-supervised models. So we compare BERT EVs with the self-supervised contrastive method SimClear. And from the results, we can see that SimClear do outperform the self-prediction methods, even though it's only 19 million parameters. For the supervised models, we compare the vowel, and perch to different supervised losses. We use CE, stands for cross entropy, supervised contrastive, and the protoclear. So from the results, we can see that protoclear performs as good as supervised contrastive while being efficient. However, we have the cross entropy that do outperform the contrastive methods. And from these results, we can see that even if we use a smaller model, we do outperform as good as Bioacoustic, which is trained using additional language model as well as other additional data. These are the results for 5-class classification. So sorry, not 5 class, but 5 examples per class. So we use all the classes from the testing data. We have similar behaviors, and even if in this case of 5-shot, we do have that protoclear can outperform supervised contrastive, because it has been trained to pull example toward their prototypes. So even in the testing scenario, this can have a good behavior. The findings of this study, we showed that invariant learning can outperform self-prediction by being smaller models. And we show that protoclear can reduce the computation of supervised contrastive without compromising the performance. And we have this study on Archive. One of the challenges and limitations of this study is that even with the other models from state-of-the-art, the domain gap between the soundscape and the vocal remains challenging. And also, we showed that contrastive methods do not outperform always the cross-entropy. And this also has been shown in the computer vision that the contrastive methods do require stronger data augmentations. So this raises questions about which data augmentation we should use for bioacoustics. Now we can conclude what we did in the 3 studies. So we focused on representation learning, especially on supervised learning with an application of event detection. We showed that decorrelating the features can generalize across species. We tested self-supervision, and we focused on data augmentation of how to learn meaningful representations without labels. And we showed that good selection strategy of windows is crucial for having good features. And for the final application, we focused on clip level classification with the domain shift between the focal and the passive recordings, and showed that proto-contrastive loss can perform as good as supervised contrastive while being more efficient. And we tested these techniques on simple few-shot metric learning technique. Also showed that we can adapt the features using prototypical learning, and it can improve the features to the problem at hand. Now for perspective, we showed the studies on the simple case of having monolabel for each problem, but in real-world scenarios, we could have multiple species vocalizing at the same time. These examples show a sound of amphibians, and we have almost 8 species that are vocalizing in a window of less than 10 seconds. So expanding the advancement of future learning to the multi-label case is an interesting direction of research. We also need to focus on robust learning, for instance, the data imbalance, because in the wild we have a long tail distribution. So we need approaches that are robust to the data imbalance. Also, we could have recording in the wild that have low SNR. So we need to either discard these sounds from our data set or correct these noises because they can affect the learning. So Xenocanto allow biologists as well as wildlife enthusiasts that are not expert to record data. So we can have some errors in the annotation. So we need robust learning approaches that can account for the noisy annotations. One interesting research direction is to the use of generative models. So we can either use generative models for data augmentation to generate more samples for our future problem, or use it to generate more views for the representation learning. We can also use generative models to add some context to the data. So for instance, we want to know how a bird sound would sound like if it was windy, for instance. We can use generative models to translate between domains. So suppose we train the model on the active sounds and we want to test it on passive sounds. If we have a model that can translate between the domains, we can go back to the active domain and test our model that is familiar with the active sounds. Another interesting approach is the multimodal learning. So it has gained a lot of popularity recently, especially in the image domain. With this word image bind, they try to bind multiple modalities and bind them together in the image domain. And this gives rise to new capabilities that are not possible with only one modality. For instance, we could do some embedding space arithmetic. So suppose we have the sound in the active domain, and we want to add some specific and context to this sound, and to maybe retrieve some similar sounds in the new domain or new scenarios. So these are the contributions that I had the chance to produce during my PhD. And we also have all the code for the experiments and the contributions that I shown on GitHub. And we also have models and preprocessed data set to help advance bioacoustics on Hugging Face. With that, I conclude my talk, and I thank you for your attention. And I'm ready to take questions.
Thank you, Ilyass, for the presentation. So we'll start the answer session. We start with the reviewers, the one that is farther away from where the thesis takes place. And I have to look at the map, but I think it's Ricard, but it's Toulon that is further away, so you have the rules.
Thank you very much for the invitation. For the topic. I will give some very quick general remarks. I think I really enjoyed reading the thesis. I think it was concise, and this is something that I appreciate when you direct it to the patients. And it was very philosophic and well explained. In that sense, I really liked it. I also liked a lot that you were rigorous in the experiments. Multiple seeds, you train several times, you talk about the problem of sensitization, you consider it, and you evaluate the results of that benefits. And it's often over. I also like that you study particular thing like this last work in which you study the gradients, how they behave, and then get insight from that. It's also very good to go down the problem. And your discussions about the results are always very mature, and you don't just talk about performance, but talk about why, and what does it tell us about the airline process. That is also something I don't want to have. And finally, we clearly see you have a very good understanding of the state of the art, and it's the things that, and you publish all the code of the experiment. That's also something I want to do. So then going to more questions about the research, I did see like during the thesis you did focus on one part of the self-supervised learning, which is more prototype-based learning and some based learning. And just quickly went through this new way of learning. We have this next token prediction methods, and you did compare to them in some cases. What do you think? This is maybe more of an open question, but where do you think is the point? Like, how do these methods scale in comparison to the scaling of these other methods?
Thank you for the remarks and also the interesting question. So for why we focused mainly on invariant learning in the first place, we first were working on medium scale datasets like the Berkeley, that is 70K recordings in the dataset. And for the self-prediction models that maybe try to predict an X token or to predict some missing part of the data, they do require more data than that. So this is the first thing. And for the experiments that we shown, that the self-prediction methods in the scale of the Zeno-Cantor training. So most models now in bioacoustics are only trained in the scale of Zeno-Cantor, which is almost 1 million sample. So for this, we can say a large scale for bioacoustics, but maybe in deep learning in general is not that large. So for this scale, the invariant learning methods can outperform the self-prediction ones. However, maybe if we move to a larger scale, now that we have applications like BirdNet that record more data, so we can have access to maybe 100 millions of data or even a billion. And there are some recent works in the image domain, like the AIM, which stands for autoregressive image model. And they try to use the same approach as BERT, which predict the next token in the image domain, and show that actually with autoregressive models, maybe we can also attain similar performance to invariant learning. So they compare to DynoV2, for instance, in the image domain, which are both trained on more than a billion images, and they perform quite similarly on multiple downstream tasks. So I guess if we have more data, maybe the learning approach is not as important as when we have only few data.
And so check the thought, but I do think it's interesting and get these type of solutions as well. Not always applicated.
Yeah, and also I use the models off the shelf. So maybe if we can use some adaptation technique, they can be adapted to domain better. Because we addressed the one-shot learning problem with one example. So we could not adapt the features that much, but maybe with more data, we can improve these models and can also perform.
One more thing that you noted that how the spec mixing was very important for the result of those methods. How do you select the non-target sounds to mix? How are you ensure that you don't end up with target sounds when doing the spec mixing? Or is it not a problem?
So I will just go back to the slide.
Slide 100.
Yeah. So so for the second contribution, we used the Berkeley benchmark, which separates the training and the test classes. So the classes that we have the training are different from the one from the test. So when we do the mixing for the training, we will never sample from the test. So we tried different selection method, and we seen that using random samples from the dataset performed the best. And the core idea of this approach is suppose that we have species A that we will have two views. So we have both views have species A. We will add the species B on the first recording and species C on the second recording. So we will have AB and AC on two views, and we'll try to maximize the mutual information between these two views. So what will come out of the model is the information of A on both views. So it will try to ignore the other information. As for the third contribution, we can have actually species from the training and testing scenarios that are similar because we focus mostly on the domain shift. So maybe that could happen in the third contribution, but for the second one, we are sure that species are different from training and testing.
One more question when you decided, and I think it's a bit after this 120, when you select your windows with bird activity, have you checked how much data you throw away for training?
So for the bird management, we have audio recordings that are between 3 seconds and 3 minutes. And we only selected 5 seconds for each audio recording. So if we have an audio recording with 3 minutes, we will only select 5 seconds. So we indeed throw away information that can be useful. And maybe we could, instead of only sampling one window per audio recording, we could allow a threshold of up to a number of windows. And that way we can have maybe more diversity in each audio recording. But we have not explored this approach.
Satisfactory result. Finally, you didn't present the mix-up and manifold mix-up, multi-mix and manifold mix-up. Is there a choice for presenting it? I had a few questions.
So I have them in the slides, but mainly the presentation, I focused on representation learning that are used for few-shot learning. But I can show a slide about this. So this is another study. Sorry, I'll let you ask a question first.
That's fine. I did like a lot this work. You try to compare different ways of doing the mix-up. And I was thinking, I mean, from what I understood, multi-mix is a generalization of manifold mix-up, because it's simply, instead of interpolating between two latents, you interpolate between multiple latents.
Yeah.
And the fact that when doing multi-mix plus manifold mix-up, you get an improvement. I found that surprising and interesting. And it kind of brought up the question of, well, if it's only one type of sampling of the weights, and the other one is another type of sampling of the weights, is there some sweet spot between those two sampling of the weights? And maybe there's even a better approach by doing proper sampling of some sort of something that have you considered?
So this is an interesting question. So in this study, we showed that if we alternate between different type of mixing, we can get better features. And the manifold mix-up will try to mix only 2 samples in the embedding space, and the multi-mix will try to combine all possible combinations in the batch of the data. And by using only mix-up and the manifold mix-up, we already got good results. And by adding multi-mix, we get slightly improvement. And one of the explanation of that is that in manifold mix-up, we have only 2 samples that are mixed. And in multi-mix, we have the number of the batch. And one assumption could be that if we can maybe mix a random number instead of just taking fixed number, that could get more diverse data in the embedding space, because we will sample in a convex space, and we will get more data points because we have the same sampling strategy. So if we use the same number of classes or number of examples, we may get the same regions in the embedding space. But by varying this number of examples to be mixed, maybe we can reach regions that were not possible by using all the samples. But this is one of the assumptions. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. These are all the kind of questions that I really enjoyed reading it and really enjoyed the presentation. So thank you a lot.
Thank you so much for interesting discussion.
So thanks for the invitation to review this. Thanks for the very clear presentation for today. So I also appreciate you research team members and it's already said, so maybe I can also give feedback about the experimental work. It's always hard to train models, in particular when you change things and was used just on the shelf models like others. Taking a lot of time. To some cases that are very theoretical, sometimes doing a lot of experiments takes a lot of time. It's appreciable. So regarding the questions, so I first have like a high level questions about like the practical interest of few-shot in general, diversity whatever. And because as you know, there is this long tail distribution that you talked about. But it's true that there are many classes with few-shots, but still there are some species with many samples. And it's also true, I mean, in the soundscape or looking at data you are updating here. So in Fusion, you have like this two-step process where you use all data in the first training, but then in the Fusion classification, you only use Fusion species. So the question is why, yeah, what kind of practical scenarios they target, because there are already frequent species also in the test set. So what is your overall like thinking about Fusion versus long tail? Why not learning directly?
So, yeah, thank you for the interesting question. So first, the few-shot learning was defined in the computer vision domain. And first, the problems were not as hard to solve. So we consider uniform distributions without long tail. And also, we have a fixed number of classes for few-shot learning. We define a simple problem. But with the advancement of deep learning and especially foundation model, the approach shifted in instead of considering only uniform distributions, now we consider all the data set with its long tail. So the second contribution, we focused on the simple scenario where we fixed the number of classes. However, for the third contribution, we use soundscape datasets with the long tail distributions. And we consider few-shot problems with all the classes in the data. And that gives a better idea of how can the model generalize. I'll just go back to the slide of the table. So, for instance, in the dataset PER, the first one, we have 132 classes. So this is this dataset contains a long tail distribution, and we can see that the models, especially the self-supervised ones, do not perform that well on this data. We have around 15% accuracy in terms of one-shot classification. So this also shows that the model, the learning strategies that are used during training are not robust to this shift in distribution, especially when we move to long tail. So maybe we can use approaches that handle the imbalance during the training. And the literature of deep learning has multiple ways of doing that. Sometimes they work on some benchmarks and other not. But with our focus on representation learning, there have been some new recent works that focus on the imbalance. So they will try either to sample more samples of the less known common classes during training, or they can use maybe, so in the contrastive, I'll just go back to the slide of the contrastive loss. So here we can see that we have in the similarities a term tau, that is a temperature that will scale the similarity of the positives and the negatives. And some works, I forgot the name of the work, but they show if we can change this temperature tau during different values. So we'll give it a small value or bigger value, and it will change the behavior of doing instance discrimination versus group discrimination. So this kind of will try to address the imbalance, because sometimes we will ask it to have instance discrimination behavior to be close to samples from the same class. And at the same time, we can, in other iteration, we can ask it to have group behavior. That means it will be similar to a group of samples instead of only the ones from the same class. So maybe if we can include also the taxonomy information in the learning, it can improve this separation between the known common classes and uncommon classes. So we have not explored to use the taxonomy, but in bioacoustics or in biology in general, we have different ranges, family, order, genus, and if you can include that into learning, that can also address this imbalance. And there is a work that I did not do, but I co-authored Ilyass Nolasco, who is a PhD student at Queen Mary, the last work of acoustic identification of individual. And in this work, Ilyass used the contrastive learning with hierarchy. And she showed that by using this hierarchy, we can also learn better features for new species. And it kind of addressed the imbalance problem. But it also opens research direction for this question. It is not solved yet.
Thanks for the very complete answer. So yeah, my second question, like maybe more related to the second step of the future learning process. So you focalize more on the learning, the self-supervised or the training, and let's say, but still, I believe the two are very closely related because still your task at end is defined by the second step. And so, yeah, one question I have is, and I mean, it's the case in many work about future learning, but say usually they use only a linear classifier or a nearest neighbor classifier for the task at end. And so, I mean, if you train a linear classifier, the gradient descent, usually on very few samples, it's stable, so you don't need some PhD thesis. And so, I mean, when we teach machine learning, we say, okay, so we know that for linear classifier, so maybe we will use like SVM to maximize the margin or doing something smarter. And so why is it never done in the future learning community? So like learning SVM or random forest or XGBoost is known to work very well when you have very few samples. And so somehow is the limitation or not in terms of evaluating the representation phase. I mean, you have representations, but if you evaluate them with classifiers that are not that good, maybe it's also biased in the evaluation. So you have an opinion on that?
So yeah, thank you for the interesting opinion. So I do agree that the representation learning literature has been mainly focusing on either using a linear classifier or nearest neighbor approach. So most of the time, the nearest neighbor approach can work better than training a linear classifier, especially when we have a domain shift. So, but why the representation learning has been focusing on simple classifiers is to mainly address the representation learning problem. But in the few-shot learning literature, there are some other approaches. I did not cover them in my experiments because I was mainly focusing on representation learning. But some approaches would consider other classifiers, maybe using kernels, and they also work well for few-shot learning. And also not XGBoost, but what was the other classifier? The SVM is also known to be used in the computer vision domain when we focus mainly on our few-shot problem and try to maximize the performance on it. So I do agree that using simple linear classifier is not optimal for that way, and addressing some other classifier that are well-known or in the machine learning can maybe work better if you focus on the part of few-shot learning.
Thank you. And in the continuity, so somehow the representation learning step is correlated to this final step. And so your chapter 5, for instance, you optimize the prototype-based approach, and so then it's better for nearest neighbor classifiers because somehow it's related. And so, would there be a way to know in advance which classifier I will use in the test at end, and then optimize this classifier during the pre-training? So maybe it's more related to the other family of things like that. But for instance, for the linear classifier, yes, it's working only with 5 classes in the test at ends. So maybe even in the first representation learning phase, you could imagine classifiers working also on 5 classes and things like that. So I was wondering whether those 2 steps should be optimized together, and let's say in the learning representations. I don't know why what I will do with that third or.
Yeah, so thank you for the interesting question. So this is actually related to the meta-learning method, where we try to optimize what we will test for in advance during training. So if we know we will try to classify only 5 classes, we will try to only optimize the transferability of 5 classes during training. So sampling random tasks during training of 5 classes. And so the question was, how can we optimize the better representations by knowing in advance what we want to test for? And I think I do have some work about this idea. So there is this work from Neurix 2020, and they address the question differently. They ask, in terms of the data, what are the augmentations that we should use for optimizing the representations? And the goal that we hope for is to maximize actually the information between our data and the label that we want for. So Y and X is our data and targets respectively. And by maximizing the information between the two views, V1 and V2, they saw that if the information is exactly what we wish for, which means the neutral information between the input and the target, there is a sweet spot that can optimize for the best representations. However, in practice, we do not have this information beforehand. So if you have only this information between V1 and V2, we miss some information that is useful for the new problem. And if we have more information, maybe that also is too much. And so we will have more noise in the information, and that will not help us to solve the task at hand. So it's still not a proven problem to find the best solution beforehand if we don't know the problem. But if we already know that we will solve a specific task, maybe with a specific classifier or a specific number of classes, we can aim for that behavior, and for that specific task we can work well.
Yeah, very interesting. And so yeah, if you take the question in the other way around, so how to know which best classifier to apply in the task at hand when you're deciding for a specific pre-training. Yeah, in some of your experiments, we saw that sometimes the linear was better, sometimes with one layer of layers. Yeah, not frozen. So yeah, could you imagine a way to choose the best one during the task at hand?
Yes, so I think this is related to the shift between the data that is used during training and the data that is used for testing. So if we know, so if we have new data from our new problem, and we can define which type of differences, we can quantify this shift. So either in the corruption, maybe we have more noise, or maybe we have different species. So there is a work called surgical fine-tuning, and they address this problem by looking at the different layers of the neural network to look at which ones should we focus more or fine-tune. So in the image domain, they saw that if we have new images with corruptions that were not seen during training, it's better to fine-tune the first layers to adapt them to the corruption. And if we have other type of shifts, maybe we classify images of faces, and we have in the training data men with blonde hair and women with black hair, and in the test data we have the reverse, the other way around. We can fine-tune the later layer of the model, and it improves the model better. So there is some rule of thumb, but it's if we can quantify this shift between the training data and this data, maybe we can have a better idea of which layers we can fine-tune. So during the experiments that I tried to adapt the model for the few shots, we only explored to fine-tune from the last layers and go back in that order. And with very few data, only retraining the last last layer worked best. But maybe if we can look at what type of corruption or type of data shift that we had between training and testing, we can find the best layers to optimize. But we did not look at that during the experiment.
Thanks a lot. Last, more fundamental question about the dimensional collapse, because I don't understand the mode collapse. So if all if years collapse to a single point, then we have a problem. Dimensional collapse, so the way you describe it, yeah, I'm asking some question, because somehow dimensionality relation is what we want. We want to reduce the dimensionality. Yes. This provides error generalization. And so here what you say that we should use as much dimensions as possible. So is the real question, should we rather use all the dimensions? We need always to have modes in this dimension, or at least have the better uniform distribution. I mean, if you talk about capacity, so is it better to have more capacity in less dimensions or more dimensions?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's really interesting. So in your network, in general, we try to compress. So we have the input data that can be audio or image. And we look at the dimension of the last layer is way less than the input. So we do want to compress. So we want to have less dimensions. But in those dimensions that we have, we want to use all of them. Because if we use only few of them for the problem, maybe let's say for some classes, the model will focus on the first 100 features. And for other classes, it will focus only on few of others. So one feature value may be useful for some data, and for other data, it will not be useful. So we want to make them all decorrelated to represent different semantics. But I do think that we do want less to compress more, but we want to use the most of the compression dimensions for our data.
Yeah, I think your capacity methods, it's good to like decorrelate the features and ensure that you will cover the space, but yeah, it's more this objective that is working than having more dimensions. So it's more having a well coverage of the space, because theoretically you could imagine that best representation would be only 1 or 2 dimensions if you can still classify your data with them. In the text domain, big models like GPT, they measure the inferencing dimension. Sometimes it's only 15 or 14, so it's much less than the actual dimension. So I think that's question simulation. It's okay. Satisfied by the answer.
Thank you.
All right, so next in line is Anwadia Messersch.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to say thank you for the presentation. It was quite nice and fluent, and it already answered some of my questions that I had before, so this is a great thing. I appreciate also in the thesis, so it was a very nice read and a very good kind of presentation of the methods and this kind of like categories of the learning methods and all, and also formal definitions. So I think it was very nicely written. I was slightly bothered by a lot of acronyms in this introductory part because I was familiar with some, but not with the others, and then some were like expanded, some were not. So it took me a while to kind of find my way around them, but then it was made much more clear in the presentation. So I think I have kind of a general question about your thesis work, because it's like very heavy on the machine learning. So what is like, let's say, the main focus? Is it the machine learning methods, or is it the bioacoustics? Like, which way lead to the other?
So it's mostly using recent advancement in machine learning and trying to come up with approaches that can work for bioacoustics. So adapting the advancement of machine learning to bioacoustics, because in bioacoustics, especially people doing deep learning, there is not a big advancement, and I thought that this can be our contribution to bridge the gaps between advancement in, for instance, audio domain and vision domain, and bring them to the bioacoustic side.
Yeah, because also, like, for example, there are a lot of baselines in the work, and also like in these answers and examples, there's a lot of talk about stuff from the vision side. And then the question is how much that vision like all the observations and these methods, okay, you work on these layers, those layers, how it translates to the audio domain? Like what kind of assumptions do you make?
So mostly recent advancement in vision in the last couple of years compared to before, they consider images as a signal without looking at specific details of what makes an image. They just look at it as a signal. And because we have more data in the image domain, we can benefit from the advancements that they can make. However, I do agree with you that not everything can go from the image and be applied to audio or bioacoustics. So we do need sometimes some specificities to our new domain, for instance, audio or bioacoustics. So for instance, we do have advancement in signal processing. Like, for instance, we have the chirplet transform, for instance. I just need to find the slide. Sorry, I put too much slide and I get lost in it. So in the bioacoustics, we borrow advancement in audio. So in audio, people use the spectrograms, and we just borrow the spectrograms and use it off the shelf. However, there are maybe some other representations that are specific to the signal domains. For instance, there is a word. Sorry, it's not me. It's not me. It's Randall Balastieri, who is an associate professor at the Brown University. And when he was working during his PhD, and I think with people from your lab, Ricard, they came up with ideas in deep learning to inject priors from signal processing. So they suggest that the chirplet transform can have more information about the bird sounds, because we know how the birds do sing. So if we, instead of using general Fourier basis, we can use one specific for the bird sounds. And they show that it can improve the learning. This was one of the ideas that I wanted to do if I had more time. Because when I was during my internship with Emmanuel at the Queen Mary, he actually has some really interesting ideas about how to exploit priors of bird vocalizations into deep learning. But sadly, I did not dig that more.
Yeah, because that was also something I was thinking of asking, that how much of the specific features of about the data that you are working with, you are using, because you can inject this kind of prior knowledge into the methods. That's something else that I was thinking when you played this example with the crops. So like there was the bird chirping, and then there's a crop, and then it sounds like you can kind of recognize it that it's a bird. But like you said, okay, maybe not a species. But why would you assume that for the neural network, the fact that the human can recognize it is important? I mean, okay, for the human ear, it sounds somehow, but do they model it the same way?
This is an interesting question. So I don't have a clear answer of how the model listens to the birds. Maybe it will find some specific features of that species that repeats itself and find some simple patterns, because we optimize with stochastic gradients. So it will just find the simplest solution to the problem. But I tried actually the randomly sized crop for for the self-supervised models, and the accuracy was really bad, only for 5 classification problem. So that's why we looked into the literature of bioacoustics, and we looked at the data augmentations that have been used. So take some time to find the slides. Yeah, so we looked at what kind of data augmentations can be used in bioacoustics. So this work, okay, I did not mistake my name this time. Ecological informatics, they try different data augmentations, one from the image domains that are not adapted to the spectrogram, like random rotations, translation, etc. Some from the signal processing domains, like the gain and the shifts, or some specific techniques only for the signal. And they also compared with spectrogram augmentations, where we can just warp the time or mask some frequencies or time steps. And from this study, they found out that the last column is the spectral augmentations to work better than the other augmentations for bioacoustics with a couple of mouse in the literature. However, this is specifically to the supervised case. And as we've seen in the ablation study, that in the supervised case, it does not matter which augmentation you use because you optimize for label invariance. But when we tried this data augmentations for the self-supervision, they have more role into the learning. So they need to keep the information that we want and not just destroy it or distort it by stretching more information that it should be done, especially for specific applications like classifying or discriminating between different species that could have sounds that are similar. So if we move beyond the range of the sound of a specific species, maybe we lose this information and that can affect the learning.
So interesting that you brought out the data augmentation because it looks like the augmentation was the solution to many things. So like first there was this like invariant learning, then for the domain also. So it's kind of like just matters what kind of augmentation you are using. And then I was thinking, for example, in this pre-trained augmentation thing, why the specific order? Like you have there this information, okay, we do them in this order. Like I don't remember how you say, like a prescribed or like you use the word there. Why exactly this order? What happens if you do it in a different order?
So we can exclude okay, let me look at it again at the order. So we started by shifting the signal either backward or forward, and then we mapped bands of frequencies and time steps, and then we mixed with a random signal. So we kept the mixing at the last order because that will also play a role in the noise or the random sample that we will sample from our data. So it will be more diverse because the same noise can be used for multiple audio recordings, but itself it can either be shifted backward or forward. So we want to maximize the number of augmentations that we can sample in the latent space. So that's why we have the spec mixing at the end after using the data augmentation. As for the time shifts, why it's in the beginning. So yes, it's for the same idea that we want, if we do apply, so actually it wouldn't matter if we change the order of time shift and spec augment, now that I think about it. It will still sample in the same regions of the space of the data augmentation. But yes, why we have the mixing at the end is that we want also the noise to be random. Maybe we want to mask some parts of the noise at different locations in the spectrum.
Okay, fair enough.
And it was also experimental. I forgot to say that because we tried also the different combinations, and this was the best.
Yeah, because like, okay, there are methods for data augmentation, and then like, how do you apply? How many of them do you choose? In what order do you put them? It's like, these can all affect the place where you end up in your training.
Yeah, luckily we only have 3, but if it was 4, it would have created more questions. Make my answer different.
Okay, so some related questions. So I also had this question about the dimensional collapse, because like the classical pattern classification long time ago without neural networks, we calculate a bunch of features like MFCCs, like handcrafted features, and then you think, okay, now I'm gonna do PCA, and then I'm gonna keep only 2 dimensions which represent most of the variance in the data, and then I can just like classify the data with these. So the fact that your network learns only uses some dimensions, what if it is correct? What if by maximizing the use, you are actually forcing it to learn like redundant information?
So yes, So the NCE, the noise contrastive estimation loss, and that is approximated with the contrastive loss that we use throughout this work. And we can see that we have here a bound between the mutual information between the first view and the second view. So that's why we try to use different and heavy data augmentations in invariant learning, so that the two views are quite different. Optimizing from space. So by actually optimizing for the contrastive loss, we can see that we actually improve or maximize the mutual information, like the lower bound of the mutual information between view1 and view2. And we also have log k, which is the number of distractors that we have during the negative contrastive loss. And so the contrastive actually will try to maximize between V1 and V2. And to talk about why we want to decorrelate the features, I should have something. So with the feature decorrelation, this is actually from the data compression literature. So we do have a vector V, the matrix V with the multiple vectors that we try to compress. And our objective is to map these vectors to binary representations, maybe binary bits. And so that we can easily reconstruct our data if starting only from the compressed code. So they make assumptions about it being Gaussian. And we have a nice formula right here that quantifies actually how we compress our data. So this is the regularization that we use. And we approximate the covariance with empirical covariance, because we don't have the exact information about it. And so this quantifies how much information we have in our code. So by maximizing this compression capacity, we tell the model compress as much as you can, but the compressed code should be representative to maybe reconstruct the data if we want it. So we won't reconstruct the data, but this is the core idea behind the compression technique that we employ. Yeah. Sorry.
I had another quite general question, because in many of your experiments, like you have all these ablation studies, so like many times the supervised method actually perform better than the self-supervised. So this kind of means that if we have labeled data, we should just use the supervised one, right?
Yes, I do agree. We should use label when we have them. But on top of that, we can also use data augmentation if it improves the feature learning. But this also means that we don't have knowledge about what kind of data augmentation we can use to model, to approximate the label. Because, for instance, in the image domain, we know natural images, how they are composed of. So they now can, with self-supervision, learn better features than with supervision. Because we know that for natural images, we can just randomly alter the pixels, the color pixels of the image and do cropping, etc. But for bioacoustics, we don't know how we can go beyond the training data to, like for one sample, we don't know how to apply data augmentation for it so that we can make it sound like a different sample from the same class. In images, maybe we can do that. But if we one day find the best augmentations to model for that label information, maybe we can just get rid of labels and use as much as label data as we can collect in the wild, but we are not there yet.
Yeah, I will not torture you more. I will just ask one more question, because I'm thinking about, many of these methods, of course, they are applicable to like whatever other few shot and kind of like when you have like restricted amount of data examples. And so, for example, this from the focal to the the
Soundscape.
thing. Like I was thinking, do you think that kind of method would be suitable, for example, for like everyday sounds that you, in the same way you can have like a focal recordings of, for example, vehicles versus traffic monitoring. So do you think that's kind of a easy leap to make?
So still in our case, we could not address this shift like 100%. We still had, we showed that all the methods that we used and ones from the state of the art still perform not poorly, but are not that great on the soundscape. So it's still not solved yet. But I think I saw some works in the audio domain that try to use generative models to maybe generate more sounds. And then if you, in your training data, you have different domains. And for instance, let's say the domain of interest is the background, the background sound. If we have different background sounds in our training data, the model by itself will try to ignore that background, because for each example of the same class with different backgrounds, it will capture only the information of the class. And that way, if we test this on a new problem with a new background sound, it can perform well because it's seen different backgrounds during training. But the problem is that it does not, for some classes, it will not see different scenarios. So we still need some techniques to account for that. Some could be used generative models to translate between domains maybe, or add some other random domains so that we have more data to train on and thus more domains to be seen during training. But I think, yes, still not 100% solved, and maybe generative models could be one way to account for that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I think we can give the floor to our guest who is online. Questions?
Thank you. Can you hear me fine?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Great. Thanks, Ilyass, for the presentation. Thank you also for inviting me to join online. I think a lot of the questions I had were already asked by other people in the jury, particularly Anna Maria. But I want to ask you a few questions on maybe some of the alternative methods that you presented in the beginning, and I wanted to hear your thoughts about them. So, meta-learning is a big sort of part in potentially as a method, model agnostic meta-learning, for instance, for a few shot adaptation. And I wanted to ask your perspective on how would that compare with, let's say, the non-parametric sort of distance-based approaches that you used?
So thank you, Moummad. So the question was how the meta-learning would compare to the distance-based approach that we use, right?
Yep.
Okay. So when future learning problems were addressed in the computer vision at the beginning, they were considering simple problems with small data sets, and that gave rise to these methods to adapt models to new problems with only few data. However, with the recent benchmarks, with larger scale learning, some of the approaches are limited. For instance, the optimization based, which is model agnostic, but it does require to have two optimization problems solved at the same time. So first, let's start by the inner problem. So we have an inner problem, and we want to optimize the parameters of the model to solve the new problem. And we will have multiple of those. So at the same time, we will have an inner optimizer that will try to optimize the transferability. So we will, when we move to larger scale, we'll have multiple problems, and that will make also the optimization more difficult. And this was one of the limitations of this approach when we moved to large scale in future learning. However, there are some advancements that I did not include here that try to kind of address this in the vision domain. Yes? You can still hear me, ma'am?
Yes, I can hear you.
So I said one of the limitations of meta learning are the large scale when we move to larger data sets, and they actually do work nicely for other problems that are not discriminative for instance, classification and detection. But since our main focus was to recognize species, we looked at the literature in the computer vision, and so the recent advancements. And the non-parametric approaches are easy to optimize, and they also are simple to include straightforward when we focus mainly on the first phase of training representations. This was for the optimization base. As for the black box, I don't think yet we found a way to make them better, because they don't have any bias about how we want to solve the problem. They will try to figure it out by themselves. So here, suppose we have a few shot problem with some data and their corresponding labels. We give it to the model. We will also give it a new sample that we want to predict the label for. So we simulate this scenario in the training and ask the model to just find a way how to combine this information together to come up with the label of our data. So it does not, we don't guide the model to find the solution. And this makes it difficult to optimize. And also in the vision domain, it has not been explored that much. So that's why we discarded the black box and the optimization for being memory and compute demanding. And we focused mostly on non-parametric.
Thanks. And so you mentioned about non-parametric at some point, and you had, I think it was slide 91, if I'm not mistaken, about saying that real-time inference might be feasible. Can you also, in addition to classification accuracy, can you also talk a bit about sort of compute demands in terms of whether real-time inference or any sort of efficient inference is possible?
Yes, thank you. This is an interesting question. So in our first contribution, when we addressed the problem of few-shot detection, so let's first look at the fine-tuning free methods. So here we train a model to extract features with supervised passive loss with addition to the regularization. And for the prototype classifier, we took the samples from the new problem and just extracted their features using the pre-trained model without any adaptation. And we computed directly the distances. So if we have a new audio recording or real-time audio that can come at us to test it, we can just apply an inference of the model in the embedding space and compute a simple distance to make the prediction. So I guess this approach would be, let's not say real time, but the only time it will take to compute is the inference of the model, because it does not require any additional steps besides counting, computing the distance between the absence and present samples. But for this second method, we fine-tuned the model on the annotations that we have. So we had 5 annotations for audio recording. So we needed extra time to do the fine-tuning. However, once we have fine-tuned the model for the problem at hand, we can just use it and it will be the same way as the fine-tuning free method. And it would require as much time just by computing inference to the model. But for new problems, it would require, again, adapting the features. And it will take a couple of minutes per audio recording to fine-tune on only 5 annotations.
Thanks. So final question. So, okay, so we talked about classification accuracy, and we talked about compute demands as well. So another point you mentioned that was, I think, slide 129, was about the fact that you were able to develop models that only supported, I think, 5 classes. So there's a question on how would these kinds of models be able to scale to a more realistic, let's say, number of novel classes?
So thank you. This is an interesting question. So these were the limitations of the existing benchmark in feature learning for audio, especially for bioacoustics. There was only the Berkeley benchmark. That's why we taken another benchmark that is used for retrieval, and we adapted it to feature learning. So in the third contribution, we addressed the problem of the shift between focal and soundscape. And these are the 6 text data sets that we used. So we have a varying number of classes per data set. For instance, the NES data set contain 89 bird species. So if we look at the performance of the models on this data set in 1 shot or maybe 5 shots. So the NES model had 89 classes. And as we can see, with our best model, we obtained 70% accuracy, which is actually quite okay or quite good for that number of classes, especially that we did not fine-tune the model. We only used the pre-trained model with the additional challenge of the domain shift. So with more number of classes, we saw that we can still get good performance. But if we compare to the PER dataset with 132 classes, the performance is way lower. So I think the scale was okay for the number of classes, but the more challenge here was the domain shift rather than the scale in terms of species.
Thanks, I see. Thank you. So a couple of questions I have more. One question I had was on your contrastive setup with the various data augmentations you did. So you mostly deal with species classification, so it might be like a clip white label, but some of your tasks were event detection, so you would need basically to have a strong prediction, like in terms of time. And I wanted to ask whether, let's say, an augmentation like spec augment, which might potentially destroy a whole time segment, might remove it completely, might be able to help with, let's say, detection tasks as opposed to classification tasks, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think I should have an ablation study for that first study. So we did try to use a spec augment, but since you said we wanted time level prediction, so we did not use actually frame level, but we took small windows to make the predictions. And this window that we taken for sliding over the audio recording and make prediction at each window was an average of the duration of the event of interest. So we had audio sounds of maybe birds that were less than, let's say, 100 milliseconds. And for other sounds, maybe the insect sounds was 10 seconds. So we had different windows depending on the species, because we had a few annotations at the beginning. So we could specify which window we want to select for that audio recording. And I should just find one slide. So yes, we took the mean of the duration, and that mean was the window that we used for making predictions. So we just slided that window across the audio recording and made prediction on each window. So either we have absence or we have presence. When we had absence, let's say it's the orange color. Once we have a next window that has the presence, which is represented by the blue window, when we have this shift between the absence and presence, we say, okay, our event starts at this moment. So we annotate the onset here. And similarly, for the offset, we did similar thing. When we change the prediction from presence to absence, we said, okay, this is the offset. And to answer the question about the data augmentation, so we used the spectrogram mixing. We used some frequency shift by shifting upwards the spectrogram by just a few bands. And we also tried to resize only time for the time step. And we multiplied the spectrogram by random value to account for different gains. And this was a study when we tried to train a linear classifier. So before using the prototypes, and as Alexei mentioned earlier, we have this instability when you use a linear classifier with stochastic gradient on a few samples. And we don't have the spectrogram mixing here, but the study showed that we required the multiple data augmentations. But as I remember, the masking of time steps did not help us to learn better discriminative features at the window level. So mostly we trained on 200 milliseconds, but then it was different for testing. It depended on the duration of each event. But it did not help masking at the time level, as far as I remember.
Thanks. Great. Last question for me, a bit more on perspectives. I think one thing I would have liked to see more was a bit on sort of the future. In your thesis, you mentioned a bit about perspectives in terms of domain shifts. You mentioned about deployment. I wanted to ask your views about sort of the applicability, let's say, of few-shot sort of models and learning methods in a sort of real-world environment. So do you envisage, let's say, that one such biodiversity monitoring application might be able to continually learn new domains? Do you see that there might be continuously new domains added, new tasks added? Do you see potential in using one big, let's say, foundation model that might be just sort of general purpose representation, and that could be used for every possible task that might be added in the future? I wanted to hear a bit more about your thoughts on how do we go from there.
So thank you for the interesting perspective. So my opinion on that is that we can, so to address first the continual learning. So continual learning can be actually framed similar to meta-learning. In meta-learning, we try to learn to learn, and in continual learning, we can frame it similarly, but with an order of sequence. So we learn the first task, then we try to learn the second task without forgetting the first one. And in the recent advancement in the literature, it is not yet solved to learn a really long sequence of tasks. So if we continue to learn, maybe that wouldn't be the optimal strategy. But since we can collect a lot of data from the wild, we can just train with as much data as we can and deploy these models. But since these models can be too large, so for instance, in the model that we compared with, we can go up to 300 million parameters, but let's say we are focusing on our models with 19 million parameters. So this model can be deployed, but they are not exactly efficient. They are convolutional transformers, but there is literature in deep learning of neural network compression, and we can compress these models to be able to be used in embedded devices. And if we can do that, we will reduce the cost of inference, and we can deploy small devices to do inference in real time, in real world scenarios. So I think this can be one of the ways to do real time biodiversity monitoring with small cost. So some of the techniques that are used in neural network compression will be efficient, like using knowledge distillation to transfer some knowledge from a bigger model to a smaller one. One way also to do that is to do some quantization, which tries to reduce the number of bits that is used to represent the weights of the neural network. Also, one possible way is to do a neural network pruning, which tries to remove some of the parameters that are not affecting the task, especially if we are specializing one device in an environment and we know that we have just a pool of species. Maybe we are in Africa and we know that we cannot have some species that are maybe in Asia. We can limit our model to a small problem, so we reduce the amount of prediction that we can make. And these kind of techniques can work in that direction. That is my thoughts about deployments in real time.
Thanks, Ilyass. And I think that was everything from me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. So we'll now give the floor to the advisor.
Should I start? Thank you, Adi. Thanks, Ilyass, for very nice presentation. So I don't have questions to ask, but I just want to make a small comment about the PhD. So it was a really great pleasure to supervise Ilyass and to work together for these 3 years. So I have to note that Ilyass is really like it was like very nice to hang out with and brought a great energy to the lab. I think it's a lot of positive attitude and also quite a fun like a way to interact with people, and I was really welcome for the atmosphere of the lab. But more like scientifically speaking, it was a really important part of the lab, and also for the scientific thematics of the lab, because it's the first PhD in audio deep learning, and so the stake was quite high to position ourselves. And Ilyass was really had a very nice way to combine things from deep learning at large, computer vision, and transfer that to what could we do with deep learning for audio and then for bioacoustics. And we are completely new in the community, and thanks to Ilyass's contributions, we're starting to transition a little bit of things. And so it's congratulations for that, for like helping everyone else to be able to position ourselves in this respect. And also want to thank, of course, Romain for joining during the second year, because the first year of the PhD was a bit different. There was like the topic was a bit different. There was also a publication that Ilyass didn't mention about that. We were working on respiration, on human respiration. And Romain joined for the second year, and we joined the case detection challenge effort, and it turned out really well. Ilyass also did a visit in Romain's lab, so I also want to thank Romain to welcome Ilyass in this perspective. And then Emmanuel also welcomed him for 6 months in London, which I think was the biggest like transformative experience for Ilyass, because he was exposed to like an more international setup lab with like many different people, lots of talks, lots of great speakers, and so on. And so thanks again, Emmanuel, for welcoming Ilyass as well. And thanks also jury today, of course, to have us with this work, and very much looking forward for what the future brings for your contributions, Ilyass, which I'm sure will be very, very, very good. Thank you very much. Would you like to go on?
Okay. Well, I don't have questions either. We had time to discuss this. Even though you did so many things that I always have the impression that I'm discovering new things in the world. Let me open the computer to pretend I wrote a speech. Let's go back to the beginning. So when you contacted me 2 years ago, it was initially just for a visit in Nancy. Decided to start working before you can Nancy, and we did spend quite a few months. And the first time we actually met, it was in Finland, because I don't know, it's probably the most convenient place to meet between Brest and Nancy, I guess. And when you came to Nancy, it was almost a year after we first discussed, and you already had a bunch of paper together. And if I should retain one thing from this work together, is how enthusiastic you are about like reading stuff and trying stuff and coming up with ideas like, oh, let's try working on amphibians with Vincent Nantes, or yeah, let's try to write ICAS paper 2 weeks before the thesis submission deadline. I guess Nicola will remember this one. I would be lying if I'd say that you were enthusiastic about everything, and there were things that you didn't like, right? Like writing the thesis. And actually spending sometimes working on this boring thesis where there are so many experiments to do, or preparing the defense. And I must say that on this later point, I'm impressed by the gap. I'm not sure the gap is sufficient between the status of the presentation last time we discussed it. It was just last week, and a very nice presentation we gave today. So, well, that was impressive. And this showed that even for those things that you didn't like, you still managed to write a really nice thesis and to give a really good presentation today. So, well, to conclude, thank you for having me on board. It was really a pleasant journey, and I guess for you it's just the beginning of the trip. And I'm confident that whatever you want to do, then you manage to do it. So good luck for what comes next.
Thank you very much.
Okay. We are almost done, but not yet. So thanks, of course, for the invitation, for the manuscript, and for the presentation. So I agree with all what my colleagues have said so far. I have one additional remark that I find important is that you shared all your code and models for people to download and work with. And I think this is a very important thing to do. It helps reproducibility and it helps science go forward. So I wanted to have a very positive remark in this regard. And I have just a couple of questions that I would like to ask. So one is maybe a little bit technical. You have made very clear that mixing these mass spectrograms is the key in terms of data augmentation. And I wanted to ask if you can share with us an intuition on why this is the key factor on the performance.
So thank you for the interesting question. So my opinion about that is that where we can mix, we can use as much data as we have in the data. So we are not limited. We actually have a limited amount of possibilities. So if we can look at the number of combinations that we can obtain by mixing each sample with the other data from the data set, so we can have a large number. And why is that the key factor? Is because we can have two samples that have two different additional bird sound. And by asking the model to optimize the rotated representation to be similar, the model will know which species we're looking for because the other two are random. So by doing that, let's say, for instance, we have species A and species B, and in the second view, we have species A and species C. We ask the model, does these two audios have similar information? So it will try to retain only the important information, which will be A in both cases, and will discard the other information from the representation. I think this is the key factor of why it is working. That's my opinion about this implementation.
Okay, thanks. So the second question is more, say, open. I don't even know if there is an answer, but I'll ask it anyway. So I have the feeling that for some annual sounds like bird calls or others, some of them might have like complex dependencies about them. They are like making calls in whether there's some sort of question answer. I think that these complex dependencies are not really modeled right now. So do you have any idea on how would you model that if you needed to? And how would you do future learning adaptation if you had to take these temporal complex dependencies over time into this regard?
Yeah, thank you. This is an interesting question that opens many research direction in the field of bioacoustics. So one of the models that we compare with from the literature tries to align audio representations with the text representations. And since we have audio recordings on these platforms like Xenocontour that are open science, they contain audio recordings with the species of interest in that audio recording, but they contain as well additional information that if the recordist knew in advance. For instance, if the recordist saw that the birds were mating. For instance, here in this example, the caption is multiple American toads, a calling and breeding. So we have this additional information in the metadata, but it does require some expertise from recordists. So not all of the data, of course, have this kind of information, but some of the samples do. And in this model, they explained or expressed it by using human language. And it ended up working well by aligning the audio representation with the text. So the audio will contain some of the encoded information from the metadata by doing this. But this is just one solution or one possible way to do it. It's a recent work from this year, but I guess that many future works maybe would include other types of signals. That joins my one of the perspectives that I talked about of using multimodal learning. And in multimodal learning, maybe we can have other types of signals. So let's say we recorded not only the audio, but also the visual data. So in the vision, maybe we can capture some information that cannot be captured by the audio alone. So maybe the environment or some other thermal data that can maybe give us information about other species that are maybe flying at the same time in the same scene. So I think that multimodal learning is one of the ways to account for that. And yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot for your answers. So as it is traditional, I would like to ask if there is any doctor in the room that would like to ask a question. Yes. Not be shy. Okay, that's not appear to be the case. So thanks for all the answers you have provided. We will go to a different room to deliberate.
Yes. Deliberation room.
Okay, good. And we'll come back sometime.
You have Emmanuel on your call.
So you have to call, everyone should quit the WebEx except Emmanuel.
Well, I sent a link to Emmanuel.
Ah, you have another link?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay.
Yep,
So
I received it.
okay, so you can, well, you can leave it open if you want.
Okay.
So I will.
Normalement,
Si je clique, c'est bon. Peut-être toujours
Matière d'initiative sur HTML, c'est bon pour le partage.
En fait, on laisse le stream, comme ça tu auras les félicitations dans YouTube. Tu auras la remise. Oui.
Ouais, on se mettra là. Là, bien, on se mettra tous là. Hein. Ouais. Oui, il y a toujours le stream. Le stream Webex, c'est pour regarder. Et du coup, en fait, il y aura la délibération là. Du coup, tu auras le ça, on regardera sur YouTube.
Ouais. En fait, il faudrait juste demander à la salle. Du coup, on peut pas du tout. Pas moyen de viennent juste intervenir. Bon, sur le système Webex, les micros de. Pardon. Non, tu vas bien nominer. C'est quoi ta première juste jardin? Ça fait pas de t'as fait genre quoi? Là, c'est bon. Félicitations. C'est pas encore fini. Moi, c'est en faire. Ils ont envoyé un mail. Non, mais c'est pas une blague. C'est pas une blague. Mais ils ont imprimé ça. Je sais pas s'ils ont imprimé, mais ils ont envoyé par mail. C'est beau, ils avaient imprimé. Ils ont tout, je dis. Si tu veux regarder maintenant le texte à dire, tu peux regarder sur ton mail. C'est envoyé. C'est pas un truc, je salue. Ouais, dans le mail. Je sais. Regarde le mail de Yasmina. On a dernier mail de Yasmina Laurent. C'est ça le docteur, il va dire. Non. Il faut vraiment on va penser à ça. Non. Il faut imprimer un petit machin qui fait 4 minutes de texte. Oui, ça réussit. Yasmina, elle fait bon, peut-être pas Ilyass. Je peux rentrer dans le je cherche. Voici. Alors, le texte, c'est ça.
C'était envoyé quand?
C'était envoyé non, ça dépend. Je vais envoyer maintenant, les gars.
Vous avez déjà marché sur la préparation.
Ah, je fais le mail Ilyass. Oh, c'est pas grave, je vais copier. Je copie. C'est la merde, tu t'envoies du score. Genre, ça, tu fais 4 minutes de test. C'est ça qu'il fait, comme ça. Mais genre, il faut juste ouvrir son portable. T'inquiète. Lui envoie pas de score.
J'ai commencé sérieusement, c'est parce que maintenant il est week-end. Parce que j'ai fait un
Il faut lui demander à l'épreuve. Ouais, demander qu'est-ce que c'est. Vas-y.
Franchement, c'est super le choix.
Chacun a une instruction. Nicolas, il n'est pas là.
C'est ce que là, il est pas là.
En fait, la spécialité dans ouais. Lui, il essaie d'être un docteur en spécialité mathématiques et sciences, technologies de l'information et de la communication.
C'est où j'ai compris.
Tu fais des pistes de spécialité, tu remplaces. Non, ça va, le texte. Le mien, par exemple.
En plus de l'installation,
Just stressed, but it's okay. He's doing too well. You know, he's setting the bar quite high.
it's a very good presentation. I think it's not an issue for you to present.
Students not.
Ouais, sur pas. T'as mis là, il veut toujours le lien. J'ai pas vu. Moi, c'est marqué spécialité électronique.
So you're going to do this.
J'avais moi-même l'actuel moi-même.
Yes, the presentation is it's not 5 minutes long, it's 30 minutes long. Like an hour. So in an hour should be enough.
Yeah,
It's a little bit,
this is more serious. Yeah.
at least a bit less stressing.
And is your family coming?
Oh yeah, they're coming on Tuesday night.
Okay.
Just friends, my parents, my brother, because he's in AI as well. So
That's your very stupid question. Do you have an older brother or a younger? Okay.
right?
Salut, ce que je suis.
I mean, that's what. Actually, I have no. You know, I have the view over the
for Vauban and Enfield and see. I mean,
If you render a place just for.
yeah, for the week.
Just great. Quindi weekend franco. No, sono venuti amici a casa una coppia greco-francese con un bambino e quindi sai, cucinare, fare quelle cose, mi sono stati bello. Però è bello, sempre quando accogli qualcuno, sempre della piena, da me non c'è. È così, e quindi tengo io. Tra gli eventi, immagino con il giudizio di assieme. Domani sera però dato che siamo io la cena al Midtown ci sarò, chiederò un po' d'aiuto anche sì. Un po', no, vabbè, tra le tante presentazioni, è permesso minore, esatto, ma adesso dato che tu sei arrivato, diciamo, che sono magari visto altre presentazioni intermedie per una o altre, tu sei arrivata ai visiting, ma insomma una bella operazione. Cosa un po' più sul materiale, diciamo, sull'implementazione, sulla un po' più lato. Tutte le altre dovrebbero essere molto pertinenti. Vabbè, ho avuto un piccolo di stress per Ilyass vedendolo lì così. Va bene. È un po' più sono sempre
Il était mort de rire et il a cessé de regarder rire en fait. Du coup, quand je bloquais, je regardais mes on peut les mettre sur les jours à
che poi lei, diciamo,
derrière
Parleur de la salle.
Non c'è un
Désolé, je vais abandonner la liste pour aller manger au
lui era molto più avanti, un po' più vedi, l'ho fatto bene mangiare con la commissione di Ilyass. Non sapevo se era mezzogiorno o un quarto, mezzogiorno e tre, ho fatto bene a mettere mezzogiorno perché là i tempi sono più.
Sur la table du doctorant, carrément, pour virer ce truc-là.
Parce que peut-être après pour les jurys, c'est.
Oui, justement, le doctorant, pour la tourner vers le jury quand même. Tu peux t'enlever, Lucas?
Ouais. Bah, c'est bien. Non, non. Oui, je suis rien. D'accord. Du coup, le jury, c'est ouais, c'est où il était. Non, mais si, c'est pas moi. C'est qu'en fait, le jury va être là pour féliciter Ilyass. Du coup, il faut le mettre de. Je commence avec quoi? Il si tu veux laisser pour il vient après que ça. Comme encadrant, Romain, quand il dit ses commentaires, j'arrive pas à savoir s'il montait ou s'il défonçait.
Et t'es rigolo.
En fait, Nicolas garde tout le cours. Pendant le cours ce soir, c'est après le 17h du matin.
Non, c'était la clé.
On va aller voir le coiffeur ce week-end. Comment? Ça fait bizarre de voir en chemise. Ouais, ouais. Plus pour moi. C'est vraiment mon cours. J'ai faim. Ah ouais. Non, mais c'est bien. Ça fait un. Soit fois la compétition que là normalement. Il y aura encore des prises, ça fait lourd. Je sais pas. J'adore les mecs. Je pense que c'est.
si j'en regarde pas.
Et en fait, l'idée, c'est que si on les... Ah, ouais, invité, genre pas nous. Ah ouais. Il reste des places. Vous allez courir? Non, c'est pas nous qui moi, jamais j'attends. Ouais, mais c'était rapide. Ça va, vous n'avez pas trop de couverture? Ouais. Moi, j'avais un peu mal aux jambes. Ouais.
Mais du coup, Ilyass ira.
Ah, t'as la musculation, c'est juste pour les déménager.
Ilyass se réserver pour
Tu es abonnez-vous, c'est encore. Ilyass, tu te rappelles de ce que tu as dit à la fin de ta thèse? Tu te remettais au sport. J'espère que j'ai bien raté les fois. Du coup, ce soir, c'est cool. Bien sûr.
on fait le repas et puis après on fait le bar.
Le bar, bien sûr, il m'a demandé de réserver parce que c'était OK.
C'est réservé un bar ou
il m'a dit que lundi, ça peut être vide.
ouais, donc de toute façon, du coup, il n'y a pas de. Ok, cool.
Je pense qu'il n'y a pas de baron pour avoir retenu.
Oui, ah oui, j'allais dire quoi?
C'est quand que tu vendredi matin?
Tu fais pas de bar vendredi, toi? Ah, ouais. Mais je sais pas si tu peux pas. Les gens veulent dire un bar après. Ouais, je pense. Justement, on parle des deux.
Je me rapproche.
Du coup, pour les gens qui font on peut se regarder.
On peut faire le bar des.
Ouais.
Wow.
Peut-être qu'on arrive à trouver.
Ça va. Délibérément, ça va être la même. Je suis arrivé à 8h du matin, la salle est c'est le bon score pour la fois. De brancher les télévisions. Ah ouais,
C'est bien parce qu'il y a un truc avec
je sais pas, en vrai, c'est une conférence un peu, tu t'en fous, tu vois. Les mecs, on a rien branlé. Ils ont rien remis. Ils bougent, mais c'est là-bas, ils ont bien là. C'est bon,
un peu envoyer un mail sur du papier.
j'ai rajouté un gros panneau en français avec marqué ne pas déranger la salle.
Mais là, c'est après, c'est pas là aussi.
Là, ça met la phrase.
Et après, on peut arrêter. Mais politique, ça marchait bien.
Là, les deux femmes qui est là.
Après, il parlait pas.
Non, il n'est pas fort, il ne pas un micro. Demain, l'activité sur les séminaires. Après, il y a
si on met une ambiance, le fou disait que les d'ambiance, Polycom disait que c'était pas fait pour. Non, c'est pas que ça marche pas.
Ça marche pas parce que tu parles.
Non, c'est pas que ça marche pas non plus.
Mais non, on entend comme si c'était.
Vous avez testé avec le micro main, on met le micro.
Ça fait peur. On a testé en se remplaçant dans toute la salle. C'est de la merde.
Non,
Bon, bah.
Moi, je ne fais pas. C'est la flemme.
Non, mais moi, je vais regarder. C'est de la merde. Le jour où on avait testé avec ma Bex, c'est la première fois qu'on a joué, moi ça marchait bien. Je suis pas sûr. Dans la maison, non, c'est dit qu'il y avait un micro magique. Moi, on a fait un peu, sans avec les cartes. Par contre, il faut mettre le chargeur sur la salle d'autres. Donc, juste.
Ça de Raphaël, j'ai tout fait.
Marrant, ça.
Oui.
On se demande pourquoi.
C'est celui après, on va faire que de la merde. Bon.
On est là en mode vas-y, on est trouvé dans un an. C'est dans bientôt. Allez.
Il n'a pas on n'avait pas gracié le dernier. Non, ça. Si. Mais c'était parce que c'est lui qui se on est où sur le passé. Non, ça va être bon, ça fait pas bien. Ah, mais c'est avec le micro pourri.
Est-ce qu'il y a
Par contre, c'est vrai qu'il y avait 4 personnes, mais deux écrans sont. Non, c'est pas grave. Il y avait genre 2 personnes plus la salle. Ça fait il y avait 1 personne à la salle.
C'était
Mais ça veut dire qu'il allait se faire parce que sur les estimations, c'est.
Mais YouTube, c'est décalé à fond.
Mais
surtout les deux écrans. Non, c'est
alors.
Des fois, ça a un décalage.
Moi, ce que je fais à ce moment-là.
Vous voyez mieux sur le côté, devant, on avait
De faire des corrections.
Si tu voulais pas me regarder sur le côté, mais j'avais besoin de 3 minutes.
Oui, c'est 6 heures, si tu as des demandes.
Ouais, laisse les dents sur le côté. Comment ça sert à lever les trucs de côté, tu vois.
Ouais.
Ce qu'elle entendait par c'est magnifique.
J'avais pas mis parce que t'as les
Ça fait.
Je peux juste faire cacher tous les vidéos.
J'ai mieux que quelque chose qui reste.
Ah ouais. J'avais bien l'impression que
Je veux pas des croissants. Comment ça, il vient un peu comme la semaine? Non, il vient sur la semaine d'après. Ouais, il bosse encore.
C'est vrai que vous êtes intéressant et que recherche.
Même il reste pas. Ouais, il a pas.
Même si tu vas pas dire. C'est quel?
En tout cas, c'est mon point faible. Et ça, à partir de là, c'est magnifique. J'ai essayé un peu de m'inspirer. Ça a été 14 heures.
J'avais dit que vous avez Non, c'est lui qui a dit ça. Ah, faut. Rien dit.
Vous allez aller, vous juste être avec un tube. Oui, oh, c'est moi. C'est moi qui reste mon truc avec mes applications inutiles.
14h30, ok.
C'est pas très rapide, ça.
Je sais pas si c'est des journées, c'est 9h30. Je crois qu'il y avait un
Bon, il y a une genre de pas là. Je ne veux pas exploser la cœur.
Je te donne 3% à la fin.
Par là, là. Ok.
On va se mettre devant. Ah ouais, c'est bon.
Tu mets devant la caméra.
Ah oui, il faut ce soir.
Ah, marrant.
On va se mettre devant là. Ils s'en viennent dans le producteur. Et Ilyass aussi, je laisse par là.
Can you all hear me well?
Yes.
Emmanuel, can you hear me well? Yes, good. All right. So, Ilyass, you have presented today your PhD with the title Invariant Presentation Learning for Future Bioacoustic Event Detection and Classification. We found that your presentation was very clear, educational, fluid, and precise, with numerous illustrations that provided an intuitive understanding of your PhD topic. Based on the thesis and the presentation, we believe that there is clear evidence that you master your field and that you have proposed grounded deep learning methods for self-supervised, contrastive, and future learning, building convincing competitive systems, and successfully deploying such complex models in various bioacoustic problems. We appreciate your efforts towards reproducibility by sharing your code and the models that you have trained via these publicly available platforms. You have responded to all the remarks and questions that we have raised with convincing arguments and detailed explanations. Your answers were very clear, insightful, and detailed. And the resulting question session turned out to be actually an interesting scientific discussion. You have demonstrated clear vision of the needs and relevant future directions in your field of research and showed scientific maturity. It is clear for us that you have more knowledge than just the topics that you exposed and discussed during the presentation. Taking into account the manuscript, the defense, and the question session, we actually believe that you are ready and suitable for an academic career. And for all these reasons, we award you the doctoral degree of the Institut Mines Telecom Atlantic. Congratulations. Thank you very much. Tu veux prêter serment.
En présence de mes pairs, parvenus à l'issue de mon doctorat en signal, image et vision, et avons ainsi pratiqué, dans ma quête du savoir, l'exercice d'une recherche scientifique exigeante, en cultivant la rigueur intellectuelle, la réflexivité éthique et dans le respect des principes de l'intégrité scientifique, je m'engage, pour ce qui dépendra de moi, dans la suite de ma carrière professionnelle, quel qu'en soit le secteur ou le domaine d'activité, à maintenir une conduite intègre dans mon rapport au savoir, mes méthodes et mes résultats.
Très bien. Merci à tous.
C'est toute l'équipe.
Et je veux dire un petit peu, la partie la plus importante.
J'ai rien préparé, mais j'aimerais remercier tout le monde qui sont venus là aujourd'hui, toute l'équipe, tous les encadrants, tous les doctorants, et surtout en particulier Nicolas Parisias, qui a beaucoup travaillé avec moi pendant ces 3 dernières années, même pendant les week-ends et après minuit du soir. J'aimerais aussi remercier Romain Parisias aussi beaucoup pour son aide et pour m'avoir donné beaucoup de confiance, et aussi d'avoir passé des fois des nuits très tard à me corriger les papiers et du code. Aussi, j'aimerais remercier beaucoup les membres du jury, aussi le président, d'être venu aujourd'hui. Et aussi, j'avais rencontré à plusieurs reprises Madame Anna Maria et Monsieur Ricard dans des conférences où j'ai pu échanger avec eux et appris beaucoup de choses. Je vous remercie beaucoup. I want to thank you for
Thank you.
Sorry, I forgot one important thing. Not with us today. I want to thank Emmanuel Benatus, who has done a lot of effort to hold me in London for a long internship, and who given me many opportunities of research in the UK. And yeah, I want to thank him a lot for helping me with my research topic and giving me good advice, and also for allowing me to collaborate with his PhD students. So Emmanuel has did many things during my stay in London. I wanted to thank him so much.
Pleasure.
Ja, félicitations. Bravo.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Congratulations.